I recently started exploring Reddit and found a subreddit that seemed like the perfect place to share a true story of mine. I occasionally dog sit for a family friend who prefers having someone stay at their house with the dogs. Growing up in a rural town, I've always loved the tranquility of the countryside, a welcome retreat from city life, where moments of solitude are rare. However, one experience during my stay at their home stands out as truly unsettling. Their house is exceptionally secluded, so remote that commuting to and from work takes 2 hours, and the nearest town or highway is a 45-minute drive away. The nearest neighbour lives across the street, about 500 metres from the house. That little bit of proximity gave me some comfort, knowing at least one person was nearby. But as I learned, this neighbour, Steve, would only add to my unease. When I arrived, Terry and Johnny, the homeowners, briefed me on the usual responsibilities: feeding the dogs, watering the plants and keeping the house in order. As they were preparing to leave, Terry mentioned that I should be aware of Steve, the neighbour across the street. Johnny chimed in, describing Steve as harmless despite his eccentric behaviour and frequent drinking, which had led to multiple licence suspensions. He now only had a moped for transportation. The conversation was light-hearted, but then Johnny showed me where they kept a loaded gun, just in case. They assured me it was unlikely I'd need it, but something about the remote location combined with the need for a gun left me feeling uneasy. Despite this, I didn't feel too worried at first. After all, I grew up in a town full of eccentric people, and I had 2 protective dogs with me. Terry and Johnny left around 3 p.m, and I spent the next few hours walking and playing frisbee with the dogs before I started unpacking. As I went outside to retrieve more of my things, I heard Steve exit his house abruptly, engaged in a phone conversation. Though his voice was faint, I caught him shouting, "Where'd you go?" The dogs, alerted by the commotion, began growling softly. "Calm down, boys, it's okay, it's just Steve," I reassured them, though I felt a little uneasy myself. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just upset and wanted some privacy. But as I gathered my belongings, I heard him again, this time yelling, "I do care about my kids." His voice was followed by the sound of something hitting the unpaved road behind me. I glanced back to see his phone lying on the ground. The dogs grew more agitated, barking and growling at Steve, who was now standing at the end of the driveway about 50 to 75 feet away. He just stood there, staring. I managed to calm the dogs and gave Steve a quick wave, trying to be friendly despite the strange situation. He didn't wave back. Steve was dressed in dirty jeans, work boots, a grimy red hoodie, and a red hat emblazoned with a Confederate flag. His hair was shoulder-length and greasy, and he had a long, unkempt beard. He took a step forward and asked, "You all right?" I introduced myself as the dog sitter and told him I was fine, but the dogs didn't relax, and neither did I. Steve kept repeating his question. "You sure you're all right?" The longer he stood there, the more uncomfortable I became. It was clear something wasn't right. After a minute of tense silence, I decided Steve must be drunk. I turned to finish unpacking, hoping he would take the hint and leave. Instead, I heard the crunch of gravel as he stepped closer. Trying to maintain my composure, I told him I was going inside. He responded with a loud, aggressive, "Yeah?" I quickly thanked him for checking on me and hurried back into the house, locking the door behind me. Steve stayed outside, staring at the house for what felt like an eternity before finally retreating. Around 6 p.m, as dusk was settling in, I was inside playing Red Dead Redemption 2, headphones on, trying to relax. Suddenly, the dogs erupted into a frenzy, charging toward the back door. Their barks were loud and aggressive, something they only did when a stranger was nearby. I grabbed a knife I kept nearby and cautiously approached the door. At first I didn't see anything, but then, through the dim light, I noticed the faint glow of tail lights. Steve's moped was parked behind my car, half hidden. He was back. I hushed the dogs, trying to remain unseen as I watched Steve from a hidden vantage point. He stood there, motionless, staring toward the house, though I wasn't sure if he could see me. After several minutes, he began walking around my car, peering into the windows as though inspecting it. The deliberate, slow way he moved sent chills down my spine. Feeling increasingly uneasy, I texted Terry about Steve's odd behaviour. Her response was immediate and chilling. "Call the police if you feel unsafe. Steve's had issues before." I didn't wait. I dialed the local police, though I knew help would take a while due to the remoteness of the area. I kept my eyes on Steve as I spoke to the dispatcher, explaining the situation. She assured me officers would be sent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if Steve decided to act, the police might not get here in time. As I hung up, he was muttering to himself, words I couldn't make out, but his body language was increasingly erratic. I turned off the lights, hoping to remain invisible, but Steve kept edging closer, his steps slow and deliberate. My heart was pounding as I grabbed the gun, keeping it close while the dogs growled low beside me. The tension was unbearable. Just as I was about to confront him, Steve abruptly turned and hurried back to his moped, speeding away into the night. Relief washed over me when I saw the police lights approaching. An officer arrived just as Steve disappeared down the road. I told the officer what had happened, and he seemed oddly dismissive, asking if I planned to stay the night. I told him I wouldn't. After ensuring the dogs were comfortable, I packed my things and left. The next day I returned with my father. We wanted to make sure Steve knew there was a male presence on the property. Steve appeared briefly, standing at the end of the driveway, beer in hand. When he saw my father, he quickly retreated. His presence may have seemed harmless at first, but I've never felt the same about that place since. For about a year and a half, I worked as a live-in caretaker for a 94-year-old woman named Marie. She suffered from Alzheimer's, and I stayed with her in her daughter's remote house, surrounded by the dense woods of Washington. Marie often mentioned seeing her deceased relatives, her sister, mother and husband, walking around the house or outside near the trees. It didn't unsettle me much, given my experience with dementia patients, but what did disturb me was her palpable fear of the woods. She would often warn me, "Don't go out there, it's dangerous and it's easy to get lost." After about 6 months of living with her, Marie's behaviour began to change. She would wander the halls at night, which is common for Alzheimer's patients. But her visits to a specific window became more frequent. One winter night, the house alarm went off, startling Marie's daughter and me awake. We checked all the doors and windows, but nothing was out of place, except for Marie. She was gone. In a panic, we searched the house and the surrounding property, but there were no footprints in the fresh snow. I finally found her standing outside her usual window, barefoot and laughing. But what chilled me to the bone was the fact that there were no tracks leading to or from her. Marie's nighttime visits to the window grew more frequent and more disturbing. Sometimes she would laugh, as if she was sharing a joke with someone only she could see. Other times she would be aggressive, pounding on the glass. And then, just as suddenly as they started, the visit stopped. Not long after, Marie passed away, but before she did, she warned me one last time. "Don't let them take you into the woods." Those words still echo in my mind, especially on quiet nights when the wind rustles through the trees outside. When I was around 18 or 19 years old, living in California, I had an experience I've never been able to forget. Near my home, there was a forest intersected by a creek, a place my friends and I often explored. Our fascination stemmed from the eerie abandoned structures scattered throughout, but there was one particular spot that always drew us back, a storm drain that emptied into the creek. It became our regular haunt, a place where strange things always seemed to happen. That day, I was with 3 friends who I'll call N, J and G. There were 2 parking lots that bordered the forest, and J and G arrived in one car, while N and I arrived in his. This detail would later play a significant role in what unfolded. We were making our way through the forest, laughing and joking like usual, on our way to the storm drain. The entrance to the drain was eerie, with 2 archways standing side by side, each about 9 feet tall. Concrete pillars lined the path, giving it the look of an ancient temple. Once inside, the tunnels sloped steeply downward, merging into one. But when we reached the top, we found it flooded from recent rainfall, forcing us to turn back. Darkness had begun to settle over the forest as we made our way out. N and G had moved ahead, leaving J and me trailing behind. Just as we approached the entrance to the drain, NS came sprinting back, his face pale and tense. Following his gaze, I saw him. A large figure dressed in ragged clothing standing next to a bicycle. His head was obscured by a grotesque monkey mask. The sight of him, out there in the twilight, sent a wave of fear crashing over us. We stood frozen, watching the masked man from about 15 feet away. He didn't seem to notice us at first, or maybe he didn't care. He was hunched over, picking up objects from the ground and placing them into a small sack. His movements were slow and deliberate. His face, if you could call it that, hidden behind the rubbery grin of the mask. Something about the whole scene felt deeply wrong. The forest, already dark and mysterious, now seemed downright hostile. J and G, visibly shaken, decided it was time to leave. They hurried back to their car, nerves frayed by the encounter. But N and I, in a moment of either bravery or foolishness, chose to stay behind, watching the man from a distance as the night swallowed the light. We climbed up a nearby hill, trying to remain out of sight, though by now full darkness had descended. As we crouched in the brush, the atmosphere of the forest transformed from eerie to terrifying. We lost sight of the man for a few minutes, and then, without warning, he emerged from the bushes, rustling the leaves as he stepped onto the path. He stopped, staring off into the distance, motionless. A cold dread crept over me. His presence felt off. Not just odd, but wrong on a primal level. Suddenly he began walking again, heading in the direction J and G had taken. N and I exchanged worried glances. We decided to follow, keeping far enough behind that he wouldn't notice us. The trail led uphill, and when we reached the crest, we spotted him again, standing still, as if waiting for something. Then, without warning, he picked up his pace, moving faster down the path. Panic surged through us. We called J and G, urging them to hurry to their car and meet us at the other parking lot on the opposite side of the forest. As we began running through the pitch-black woods, our path illuminated only by the shaky beams of our phone flashlights, an even more unsettling sound filled the air. It started as a low howl echoing from the trees, but it quickly grew louder, ape-like screams coming from every direction. The sound was unnatural, too deliberate to be an animal. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as adrenaline pumped through my veins. N and I ran faster, the yells chasing us, surrounding us. Finally, we burst out of the trees and into the parking lot. The screeches and howls ceased as suddenly as they had begun. J and G were already there, waiting for us, their faces pale and anxious. We left the forest together, all of us trying to make sense of what had just happened. The encounter was bizarre, terrifying, and difficult to explain. I'd heard rumours before about a secretive Buddhist temple hidden deep in the forest, and I wondered if there was some connection between the strange noises and the man in the mask. I later learned that a police officer had once warned a group of kids in the forest that the monks weren't fond of trespassers, especially at night. He even shared his own story of being asked to leave by a monk who spoke to him from the trees. Over the years I've returned to that forest, though never alone. Each time the memory of the monkey man lingers in my mind, and though I haven't encountered him again, the forest still feels like a place filled with secrets I may never fully understand. The eerie howls, the masked figure, and the unsettling presence of something unknown make me wonder what really hides in those woods.